I still remember the exact second I realized something was wrong. I was standing in the narrow hallway outside my apartment, my hand hovering inches from the doorknob, listening to a voice that did not belong there. My sister's voice, inside my home, laughing, comfortable. The kind of laugh you only make when you believe you are exactly where you're supposed to be. I hadn't told anyone I'd be working late. I hadn't invited anyone over. I hadn't given permission for a single person to step foot inside that space. And yet, through my own door, I could hear cabinets opening, a familiar pop song playing softly, footsteps moving across my living room like muscle memory had already been formed. I didn't unlock the door right away. I didn't knock. I didn't call out. I stood there frozen, realizing that the one place I'd built to feel safe no longer belonged to me. What I didn't know yet was how they got in. What I did know was that this wasn't an accident. So instead of walking inside and reacting the way I was expected to, I stepped back, pulled my phone from my pocket, and made one call that would change everything. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. The overhead light flickered the way it always did, casting that dull yellow glow that made everything feel slightly unreal. I leaned my shoulder against the wall and listened. My sister was humming now, rummaging through something that sounded like my kitchen drawers. The sound landed in my chest like a small, sharp weight. This apartment wasn't much to look at from the outside. Beige building, narrow balconies, no fancy lobby or security desk. But to me, it was everything. It was the first place that had ever been mine. My name on the lease. My paycheck covering the rent. My rules. No one telling me when to come home, no one borrowing my things without asking, no one reminding me that I owed them something just for existing. I unlocked the door slowly, quietly, almost out of curiosity. The deadbolt slid back with a sound that felt too loud, too final. When I pushed the door open, the smell of someone else's perfume hit me first. Not mine. Something floral and sweet, the kind my sister always wore. My stomach tightened. She was standing in my kitchen with her back to me, barefoot, wearing one of my mugs in her hand, like she'd always owned it. Her suitcase sat open by the couch, clothes folded neatly on my coffee table. My coffee table. Her jacket hung over the back of my chair. She turned when she heard the door and smiled like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Oh, hey," she said. "You're home early." I wasn't. I was right on time. But that detail didn't seem to matter. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice sounded calm, which surprised me. Inside, everything felt unsteady, like the floor had shifted a few inches without warning. She shrugged, took another sip from my mug. "Mom said it was fine. Just for a little while. You know how things are right now." Things. That word did a lot of work in our family. It covered messes, bad decisions, emergencies that somehow always landed on my doorstep. I looked around the room slowly, letting my eyes take inventory. The throw blanket folded differently. My shoes pushed aside near the door. A stack of mail moved from where I always kept it. Every small change felt deliberate, like someone had come in and rearranged my life while I was gone. "Where's Mom?" I asked. "She'll be by later," my sister said. She helped me get settled. She smiled again, softer this time, like she was trying to reassure me. "It's just temporary. I promise." Temporary. Another family favorite. I nodded once, set my bag down by the door, and walked past her into my bedroom. My bed had been sat on. I could tell by the way the comforter was creased by the faint dip near the edge. Someone had opened my closet. One of my hangers was turned the wrong way. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, pressing my palm flat to the wood. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears, but my mind was strangely clear. This hadn't happened on impulse. My sister didn't just wake up one morning and decide to move into my apartment. Someone had planned this. Someone had decided I wouldn't say no if they didn't give me the chance. I grew up being the easy one, the flexible one, the one who didn't make scenes. If something needed to be handled, it somehow always landed with me: babysitting, running errands, covering shifts, making space, giving up plans. People called it being helpful, being mature, being good with responsibility. What they really meant was that I didn't fight back. When I moved into this apartment 2 years earlier, it felt like I had finally stepped outside of that role. I worked long hours, saved every extra dollar, signed that lease with shaking hands, and a smile I couldn't wipe off my face. No roommates, no family keys hanging by the door. Just me and a space that stayed the way I left it. Until now. I went back into the living room. My sister was scrolling through her phone, already settled on the couch. I noticed then that the spare key bowl by the door was empty. "Where did you get the key?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Mom had one, remember? From when she helped you move. She said she'd keep it safe." My chest tightened. That key had been for emergencies. Or at least, that's what I'd been told. A backup. Something responsible adults did. I had never imagined it would turn into an open invitation. I didn't say anything else. I went into the bathroom, turned on the sink, and stared at my reflection. I looked tired, older than I felt. There was a faint line between my eyebrows that hadn't been there a few years ago. This was the moment I was supposed to explode. Demand answers. Threaten to kick them out. Call my mother and ask what the hell she thought she was doing. That was the reaction everyone expected from me. But something in me paused. If I reacted now, they'd spin it. I'd be dramatic, ungrateful, cold. They'd remind me of everything Mom had done for me, how hard my sister's life was, how family helps family. I knew the script by heart, so I did something different. I stayed quiet. I made dinner for myself and ate it, standing at the counter while my sister talked about her problems like I was an audience, not a homeowner. I nodded in the right places. I asked neutral questions. I listened. And I watched. She slipped up once, casually mentioning that Mom had been by earlier that week to measure the spare room, just to see if a mattress would fit. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Earlier that week. While I was at work. That was when the last piece clicked into place. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't help. This was a decision that had been made without me, about me. Later that night, after my sister went to bed in my guest room with the door closed like it belonged to her, I sat alone on my couch and stared at the front door, at the lock, at the small, ordinary piece of metal that had failed me so completely. I knew exactly who in my family benefited most from never asking my permission, from assuming my space, my time, my stability were available on demand. I also knew that if I handled this the way I always had, nothing would change. So I opened my phone, scrolled past missed messages from my mother, and tapped a number I hadn't planned on using so soon. I didn't explain everything. Not yet. I asked a few careful questions. Hypothetical ones. I listened closely to the answers. When I hung up, my hands were steady. I went to bed that night in a room that no longer felt entirely like mine, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. And I had already decided I wasn't going to pass it quietly. I had spent most of my life being described with the same handful of words: reliable, steady, easy to count on. People said them like compliments, like proof I was doing something right. What they never said out loud was what those words actually meant in my family. It meant I was the one who bent first, the one who adjusted, the one who filled the gaps when everyone else decided they were tired. I didn't become that way overnight. I was trained into it slowly, gently, with praise and expectation wrapped so tightly together that I didn't notice the difference until much later. When I was young, if something went wrong, a missed pickup, a forgotten appointment, a child who needed watching, my mother's eyes always found me first. Not because I was the oldest or the strongest, but because I didn't protest. I showed up. I handled things. I made her life easier. "You're so mature for your age," she used to say, smoothing my hair, her voice warm and approving. I wore that sentence like a badge. I thought it meant she trusted me. I didn't understand yet that it also meant she felt entitled to me. My sister grew up under a different set of rules. Where I was prepared, she was protected. When she made mistakes, they were framed as learning experiences. When I did, they were framed as disappointments. She could stumble and still be caught. I was expected not to stumble at all. If she forgot to pay a bill, there was an explanation. Stress. Bad timing. Someone else's fault. If I hesitated to help even once, it became a character flaw. Why are you being difficult? Why are you making this harder than it needs to be? Don't you care about family? I didn't resent my sister for it. Not really. I internalized it instead. I learned that fairness wasn't something you demanded. It was something you worked around. I learned that peace came from compliance, not honesty. My mother was very good at making control sound like concern. To the outside world, she was charming, generous, the kind of woman people trusted immediately. She remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful texts, showed up with casseroles and smiles. Inside our family, she ran everything through a different system. Her currency wasn't money, it was obligation. She loved phrases like "do the right thing" and "think about how this looks." She measured choices by how they reflected on her, on us, on the family as a whole. Disagreement wasn't just disagreement, it was disloyalty, it was embarrassment, it was something that needed to be corrected. When I moved into my apartment, I truly believed I had finally stepped out of that orbit. I was exhausted in the best way, working long days, saving what I could, building something that was just mine. Signing that lease felt like breathing fresh air after years in a closed room. I remember standing in the empty living space, keys in my hand, thinking, this is it. This is where my life finally starts to belong to me. My mother insisted on helping me move. She insisted on holding a spare key. Just in case, she said, her tone light, reasonable. What if you lose yours? What if something happens? I didn't argue. Arguing felt ungrateful. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a key. Looking back, that should have been the moment I paid closer attention. She didn't see my apartment as a boundary. She saw it as an extension, extra space, a resource, something flexible. There had been other moments, too small ones I brushed aside because they didn't seem worth the friction. A comment here about how big my place was for just one person. A joke there about how it would be perfect if someone needed somewhere to land. A suggestion that sounded hypothetical until it wasn't. There was also something else, a history I never fully questioned. Years earlier, there had been an incident involving my mother and a neighbor. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I felt entitled to dig into. A disagreement over access. Over assumptions. It had ended quietly, with my mother frustrated but unchallenged. At the time, I accepted her version without thinking too hard. She had always been the adult, the authority. I see now how often I avoided asking questions, because asking meant conflict, and conflict meant consequences. Silence kept things smooth. Silence kept me safe, or so I believed. Standing in my apartment with my sister unpacking like she planned to stay, all of that history rushed back with uncomfortable clarity. This didn't feel like a one-time lapse in judgment. It felt familiar. It felt practiced. That night, after she went to bed and the apartment finally went quiet, I sat on the edge of my couch and tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't just anger. It was grief. Grief for the version of my family I had wanted to believe in. Grief for the years I had spent confusing usefulness with love. I realized then that my mother hadn't copied my keys because she didn't trust me. She had copied them because she trusted herself more. She trusted her right to decide what happened in my life, even when I wasn't there to agree. I also realized something else. something that sat heavy but undeniable. I had made this possible. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through years of predictability. I had always stepped in, always absorbed the inconvenience, always fixed what wasn't mine to fix. Predictability had made me easy. That understanding didn't come with immediate courage or clarity. It came with a quiet shift. A sense that whatever happened next, I couldn't afford to pretend this was just family stress. This was a system. And systems don't change because you ask nicely. The next morning, I woke up early, long before my alarm. The apartment was already stirring. I lay there listening to my sister move around using my kitchen, my bathroom, my routines, like she'd been doing it for weeks. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic this time, but resolve. I wasn't chosen because I was strong. I was chosen because I was expected to comply. And the moment I stopped being predictable, I knew everything else would begin to unravel. I got dressed quietly, grabbed my bag, and left for work without saying much. My sister barely looked up. "Mom will call you later," she said casually, like it was already decided. I nodded, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded different that morning. Not like safety, like a warning. And as I walked down the stairs, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. This wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about changing the role I'd been cast in. Whatever came next, I knew it would cost me something. I just didn't know yet how much. By the time I got home that evening, the apartment no longer felt like a place I lived. It felt like a place I was allowed to visit. The lights were on when I opened the door, even though I always turned them off before leaving. My sister was already there, moving around the kitchen with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you belong. The radio was playing softly. Something warm was simmering on the stove. The smell of garlic and onions hung in the air, familiar and foreign at the same time. "You're late," she said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "I thought you'd be back earlier." I set my bag down slowly, letting the weight slip from my shoulder. I hadn't told her what time I'd be home. I hadn't told anyone. The fact that she expected me at all made my skin prickle. "Traffic," I said, because it was easier than saying nothing. She nodded like that answered something important. "I'm making dinner. Mom said we should eat together tonight." Mom said. There it was again. Decisions filtered through someone else and handed to me like instructions. I walked through the living room, taking in the details I'd missed the night before. My bookshelf had been rearranged. Not badly, not disrespectfully, but differently. The stack of mail I always sorted on Sundays was now fanned out on the table like it had been reviewed. A pair of shoes I didn't recognize sat neatly by the door. It wasn't chaos. That was what made it worse. It was order imposed without permission. The next morning confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. I woke up to the sound of the shower running. My alarm hadn't gone off yet. Someone else was using my bathroom. My hot water, my morning routine, without a second thought. When I finally made it into the kitchen, my sister was at the counter scrolling on her phone, a grocery list beside her. She didn't look up when I entered. "We're low on milk," she said. "And coffee. I'll grab some later." "We're," I repeated silently. "Not I. Not you. We." I poured myself a cup from the pot she'd already brewed, noticing the brand was different from the one I usually bought. Small things. All of it small, until it wasn't. Over breakfast, she talked about her plans like they were already agreed upon. Doctor appointments. A meeting with her lawyer. She mentioned staying with me for at least a couple of weeks, maybe longer, depending on how things went. "Next week," she said casually, "I might need you to be home a little earlier. I have an early appointment and I don't want to rush." I looked at her then. Next week. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Next week. "You're assuming a lot," I said carefully. She shrugged. "Mom said it was fine. She knows you don't mind." That sentence landed harder than anything else she'd said. Not you said it was fine. Not we talked about it, Mom said, as if my consent was optional, interchangeable with hers. Later that afternoon, my mother stopped by. She didn't knock. She used the spare key like she'd always intended to. The sound of the lock turning made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't ignore. She breezed in carrying a bag of groceries, smiling like this was all a pleasant inconvenience. "There you are," she said. "I wanted to check in. Make sure everything's settling okay." Everything, I said. I didn't realize everything had already been decided. She waved a hand dismissively. "Don't start. This isn't the time. Your sister needed help. You have space. You're good at managing things. This just makes sense. Makes sense to who I asked." She gave me a look I'd seen my entire life. The one that suggested I was being unreasonable. To anyone with common sense. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger exactly. More like cold clarity. "You moved her in while I was at work," I said. "You didn't ask me." My mother sighed like I'd just said something exhausting. "We knew you'd overthink it. It was easier to get her settled first and talk later." Talk later. After the decision was already made. That was when my sister said something she clearly hadn't meant to. She laughed lightly and said it was lucky my schedule was so predictable. Mom knew exactly when I'd be gone long enough to move everything in without a scene. The room went quiet. I looked at my mother. She didn't deny it. She just smiled tightly like she'd been caught, but not ashamed. "We didn't want to stress you out," she said. This way, it was done. That was the moment it became undeniable. This wasn't help. It was strategy. They hadn't asked because they didn't want an answer. They had planned around my absence, around my work hours, around my tendency to smooth things over instead of exploding. I thought about my lease then, about the clause I'd skimmed when I signed it, the one about unauthorized occupants, about liability, about how easily my stability could be threatened by someone else's decisions. I asked my mother what she'd told the landlord if anyone asked questions. She laughed. "No one's asking questions. And even if they did, I'd handle it." "You worry too much." That was the first implied threat. Subtle, wrapped in reassurance. "Don't worry. I'll take care of it." Which really meant, don't interfere. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, rereading my lease. The language was clear. Brutally so. I was responsible. Me. Not my mother. Not my sister. Any violation landed on my name. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. A reminder to be flexible. To remember family comes first. To not make this harder than it needed to be. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Small comments, heavy sighs, remarks about how people might see things if I caused problems, about how hard this was on my sister, about how disappointed they would be if I forced a confrontation. I kept my voice even. I nodded. I listened. And I started paying attention. I noted dates, times, statements that contradicted earlier ones. I watched how my mother spoke when she thought she was in control, and how quickly that tone shifted when she felt challenged. Silence became my strategy, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something. As long as I argued emotionally, I would lose. As long as I reacted the way they expected, the story would stay the same. So I stopped trying to fix it. One evening, as my sister talked on the phone in the living room, I caught a phrase that made my stomach drop. She mentioned staying until things were sorted, until Mom figured out the next step. Not until she found her own place. Not until we talked. Until Mom decided. I went to my bedroom and closed the door quietly behind me. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I accepted what I'd been avoiding since the first night. This situation wasn't temporary. It was a takeover disguised as care. Family loyalty was being used as leverage and my housing was the collateral. I wasn't dealing with misunderstanding. I was dealing with entitlement. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay there listening to the sounds of my apartment being lived in by people who didn't ask permission, thinking about what it would mean to keep pretending this was normal. By morning, the answer was clear. I couldn't act like myself and expect to be protected. The version of me they knew was too easy to ignore. And as I got dressed for work, stepping carefully around boxes that hadn't been there a week earlier, I stopped thinking about how to make this comfortable. I started thinking about how to survive it. The apartment stopped feeling neutral after that. It didn't just feel crowded or inconvenient. It felt supervised. I noticed it first in the way my mother moved through the space, not like a guest, not even like a visitor, but like someone checking inventory. She opened cabinets and closed them again in a different order. She stacked dishes the way she preferred. She shifted the rug in the living room a few inches to the left and nodded to herself like she'd improved something. I came home from work one evening and found her standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled up, wiping down the counters. She smiled when she saw me, the same practiced smile she used on neighbors and coworkers. "I took care of the fridge," she said. "There were things in there that were about to go bad." I looked inside. Food I'd bought was gone, replaced with items she preferred. Not spoiled, not expired, just not hers to touch. I didn't say anything. I set my bag down and watched her move. That was when I realized how easy she looked. Too easy. Like someone who believed resistance had already been dealt with. "We should talk about some ground rules," I said carefully. She didn't stop wiping the counter. "About what?" "About you rearranging my place. About who decides things here." She sighed long and patient, like I'd just asked something tedious. "Honey, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're just trying to get through a rough patch. Your sister is under enough stress already." I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the way my feelings always came second to someone else's emergency. "This is my apartment," I said. "I need to be involved in decisions." She turned then, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed. And there it was. The shift. Her voice stayed calm, but something sharpened underneath it. "Of course it's your apartment. No one's saying it isn't. But you don't live in a vacuum. People notice things. Neighbors. Management. It wouldn't look good if there were complaints. Especially right now." I stared at her. Was that a warning or a threat? I couldn't tell, and that was the point. "I'm not planning on causing problems," I said. "Good," she replied quickly. "Because that would put us all in a difficult position." Us. Another word that blurred responsibility until it disappeared. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my apartment being used without me. The low murmur of voices. The TV turned up just a little louder than I liked. The bathroom door opening and closing. Every sound reminded me that my control over this space was already slipping. The next day, my sister mentioned that Mom had talked to someone downstairs. Just a quick hello. Nothing serious. She said it casually, like she was sharing a harmless detail. I asked who. "The woman across the hall," she said. "Mom told her we're staying here for a bit. She said it's great you're helping out." My stomach dropped. I hadn't agreed to anything. And now the story was already spreading, shaped and softened by someone else. When I brought it up later, my mother waved it off. "People talk. It's better they hear it from me than make assumptions. You don't want to look unstable." That word again. Look. I started to see the pattern clearly. She wasn't just managing the situation inside my apartment. She was managing the narrative outside it. Positioning herself as reasonable. Positioning me as emotional, potentially unreliable if I pushed back. One afternoon, while she was on the phone in the living room, I overheard her say my name. Not loudly, not angrily, just matter of fact. She said she'd handle me. That I was just overwhelmed. That she knew how to calm me down. I went into my bedroom and closed the door quietly, my hands shaking. Not with fear, but with something colder. Recognition. This wasn't about helping my sister. It wasn't even about family convenience. It was about control. About making sure that if things escalated, my credibility would be questioned before hers ever was. That evening, I found an envelope on the kitchen table. It wasn't addressed to me. It was paperwork. Notes. A list of phone numbers written in my mother's handwriting. Management, maintenance, emergency contacts. "Why do you have this?" I asked, holding it up. She looked surprised for half a second, then smoothed it away. "I like to be prepared. If something happens while you're at work, someone has to know who to call." "I am the one who lives here," I said. She smiled, but her eyes didn't soften. "And I'm your mother. I've always handled things when you couldn't." That was the line I didn't know she'd crossed until she said it out loud. She didn't see herself as a backup. She saw herself as the authority. Later that night, my sister pulled me aside. She looked tired, her voice low. "She's just trying to help," she said. "You know how she gets when she feels like things are out of control. If you push too hard, she'll dig in." I looked at my sister, then really looked at her. She wasn't defending my mother because she believed she was right. She was defending her because it was easier than standing on her own. I understood that. I'd lived it. But understanding didn't make it acceptable. Over the next few days, the language shifted. My mother stopped asking if things were okay and started saying when things would happen, when my sister would be home, when I needed to adjust my schedule, when we would revisit the arrangement, which always meant later, never now. If I hesitated, she reminded me how much stress she was under. If I pressed, she mentioned how embarrassing it would be if this became a bigger issue, how people might talk, how landlords were so sensitive these days. I read my lease again every night. The words felt heavier each time. Unauthorized occupants, responsibility, liability. Family had stopped feeling like support. It had become a risk. One afternoon, I came home early and found my mother in my bedroom. She was standing near my closet, holding one of my sweaters. "I was just making room," she said. "You've got a lot of things you don't really wear." I took the sweater from her hands. "This is not your room." She stiffened. "I'm trying to help you organize." "I don't want help," I said. "I want my space respected." Her expression hardened just slightly. "You're being very sensitive." That word again. Sensitive. The family code for unreasonable. I realized then how personal this had become. It wasn't just about where my sister slept. It was about whether I was allowed to say no without being punished for it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. The apartment was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm before something irreversible. I thought about what would happen if a neighbor complained, if management noticed extra cars, extra noise, extra people. I thought about how quickly blame would shift, how easily I could be framed as the problem in my own home. Silence alone wouldn't protect me, politeness wouldn't either. I understood then that I wasn't just facing inconvenience or discomfort. I was facing someone who was willing to threaten what kept me housed in order to stay in control. And once someone is willing to do that, staying quiet stops being neutral. It becomes dangerous. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked through the apartment slowly, room by room, noticing what had changed, what had been moved, what no longer felt like mine. By the time I reached the front door, my decision wasn't emotional. It was practical. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a power struggle. And I knew with a clarity that didn't leave room for doubt that if I didn't change the way I handled it now, I would lose far more than my patience. I just hadn't decided yet how far I was willing to go. I didn't raise my voice after that. I didn't threaten anyone or demand explanations. I did something far more unsettling for people who were used to controlling the narrative. I went quiet in a way that wasn't passive. The shift happened inside me first. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped reacting in real time to every small violation and started watching how those violations stacked up when no one thought I was paying attention. My mother and sister mistook my calm for surrender. I could see it in the way they relaxed. In the way my mother started making decisions out loud instead of testing them first. In the way my sister talked about plans that didn't include me but assumed my cooperation anyway. "We'll need the living room tomorrow afternoon," my mother said one morning while stirring her coffee. "Your sister has a call she needs privacy for." I nodded and kept eating my toast. My sister glanced at me a little surprised. "You okay with that?" I looked up, met her eyes, and smiled faintly. "Sure." That one word seemed to unlock something in them. They took it as confirmation that they were right all along, that I would adapt, that this would settle the way things always had. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't agreeing anymore. I was collecting. I started noticing patterns. Not emotional ones, practical ones. Dates when my mother used the spare key. Times when she let herself in while I was at work. The way she referred to my apartment as ours when talking to my sister, but yours when speaking to me, as if ownership shifted depending on who needed convincing. I noticed how often my sister deferred to her. How rarely she took responsibility for anything without checking first. How comfortable she was letting my mother negotiate on her behalf. I noticed things they didn't think mattered. Like the fact that my mother kept a small notebook in her bag where she wrote down numbers and reminders, or that she always positioned herself closest to the door when visitors came by, or that she answered questions directed at me before I could speak, especially if they involved logistics. Power, I realized, rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in assumptions. At work, I functioned the way I always had. Focused, efficient, competent. I handled complicated systems for a living. Policies, procedures, risk mitigation. The kind of work where details mattered and emotional reactions only clouded judgment. It struck me one afternoon sitting at my desk that I had been using those skills everywhere, except where I needed them most. At home, I defaulted to being a daughter. At work, I was a professional. Calm, precise, hard to corner. That version of me had leverage. I just hadn't brought her home before. That evening, I listened instead of speaking. My mother talked about how stressful things had been for her lately, how she was juggling so much, how she worried about my sister and wanted what was best for both of us. I nodded. I asked neutral questions. I let her talk. And she slipped. She mentioned coordinating with the building manager weeks earlier. Not about us. Just small talk, she said. Getting a feel for how strict they were. Seeing what kinds of situations they tolerated. My fork paused midair. "You talked to the manager," I said evenly. She waved it off. "Everyone chats. It's a friendly building." That was new information. Important information. And she had offered it without realizing what it meant. Later, my sister complained about how inconvenient it was that the guest room didn't have enough storage. "Mom said we could move some of your things to the hall closet," she added casually. "Just until this is sorted." "Until what is sorted?" I asked. She hesitated. "Until we figure out next steps." "Who is we?" She shrugged. "Mom's handling it." There it was again. The deferral. The assumption. The quiet admission that I was not part of the decision-making process in my own home. I excused myself and went to my room, closing the door gently behind me. I sat on the bed and let the pieces settle into place. This wasn't about needing help. It wasn't even about disrespect. It was about authority. About who had the final say. And my mother had never adjusted to the idea that it might not be her anymore. I thought about all the times she had spoken for me. All the times I had let her. All the moments when my silence had been interpreted as consent. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me focused. From that night on, I listened for inconsistencies, and they came quickly. My mother told my sister one thing and me another. She claimed she had cleared something with me that she hadn't. She framed my hesitation as stress when speaking to others and as stubbornness when speaking to me. I didn't correct her. I let the contradictions exist. I wrote things down. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Just dates and phrases in the Notes app on my phone. Nothing emotional. Just facts. One afternoon, my sister mentioned that Mom had told her I was struggling, that I was overwhelmed and needed help managing everything. That was news to me. When I asked my mother about it later, she smiled sympathetically. I was just explaining things. You've been under a lot of pressure. Anyone would be. I realized then that she was already laying groundwork, not just inside the family, outside it. That's when I made a promise to myself. Quiet. Firm. I would not let anyone else define my stability. The temptation to confront them head-on was strong. I imagined listing every violation, every assumption, every moment they had crossed a line. But I knew how that would end. With tears. With accusations. With me being labeled emotional. So I chose a different approach. I let them talk. I let my mother explain her reasoning in detail. I let my sister complain. I let assumptions stack up. Because every sentence they spoke without caution was a thread they couldn't pull back later. One evening, as we sat in the living room, my mother mentioned that if anything went wrong, she would handle it. She always did. She had experience dealing with situations like this. Like what I asked lightly. She hesitated just for a moment. Then she said, property issues, family matters, situations where people overreact. People like me, she didn't need to say. I nodded and said nothing. Inside, something settled into place. Not rage, resolve. I accepted that this wouldn't end with an apology or a gentle conversation. I accepted that keeping the peace would cost me more than losing it. The clarity was almost calming. Late that night, when the apartment was finally quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The light above the stove hummed softly. I opened my laptop and pulled up my lease again. Read it line by line. No skimming, no assumptions. The words were unforgiving. Unauthorized access. Unauthorized occupants. Responsibility assigned to the leaseholder. Me. I closed the laptop and sat back staring at the dark window. I thought about how easily my housing could be put at risk by someone who didn't bear the consequences. How my mother spoke so confidently about handling things that wouldn't land on her record. I wasn't willing to lose my home to preserve her sense of control. That was the first time I allowed myself to fully commit to what I had been circling around for days. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about protecting myself. And once that line was drawn, the path forward became clearer. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to be precise. Because once I started paying attention, I realized something they hadn't counted on. I already had more leverage than they thought. And the moment I decided to use it, nothing about this situation was going to stay comfortable. Sleep stopped coming easily after that. Even when the apartment was quiet, my mind wasn't. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the building settling the faint sound of my sister turning over in the guest room. Every noise felt like a reminder that I was no longer the only one carrying the risk of this place, but I was the only one responsible for it. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen. The overhead light felt too bright, too honest. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at the door like it might explain something to me if I looked long enough. What happens if this continues? I thought. Not emotionally, practically. What happens if a neighbor complains? If management notices extra cars, extra noise, extra people? What happens if something breaks? If someone gets hurt? If a key goes missing? Every scenario ended the same way, with my name attached to it. The fear wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and relentless, the kind that doesn't shout but refuses to leave you alone. I opened my laptop and pulled up the lease again. I had read it so many times I could practically recite parts of it, but I read it anyway. Slowly, carefully, no skimming, no optimism, just the words as they were written. No additional occupants without written approval. No duplication of keys without consent. The leaseholder assumes full responsibility for all occupants and guests. There it was, clear as day, no room for interpretation, no allowance for family circumstances, no clause for good intentions. I closed the document and sat there for a long time, the weight of it settling into my chest. Silence wasn't neutral anymore. Silence was a risk. The next morning, I went to work on autopilot. I answered emails, sat through meetings, took notes, smiled when required. All the while, the question stayed with me, steady and insistent. Who do I talk to when the people causing the problem refuse to see it as one? I wrestled with that for hours. The urge to confront my mother again rose and fell like a tide. I imagined laying out the facts, pointing to the lease, demanding she back off. I also imagined her response. The sigh, the disappointment, the reminder of everything she'd done for me, the way she'd frame my concerns as anxiety instead of reality. By the time I drove home that evening, I knew confrontation wouldn't protect me. It would only alert her. I needed information, not permission. After dinner, after my mother and sister had settled into the living room, I retreated to my bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand, staring at the contact I had saved weeks earlier but never expected to use. I told myself I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't reporting anything. I was asking a question. Hypothetically, my thumb hovered over the screen longer than I wanted to admit. Making this call felt like crossing a line, not legally, emotionally. It meant accepting that this was bigger than family conflict. I pressed call. The woman on the other end answered calmly, professionally. I explained my situation in careful terms. I said I lived alone. I said someone had been accessing my apartment without my permission. I said additional people had moved in while I was at work. I asked what that meant. She didn't gasp. She didn't sympathize. She didn't ask why I let it happen. She explained. She told me what unauthorized access meant, what copied keys meant, what additional occupants meant in a legal sense. She told me who was responsible if something went wrong. She told me how situations like this were typically handled. The answers were clear, unemotional, damning. By the time the call ended, my hand wasn't shaking. My chest felt tight, but my mind was sharp. There was no confusion left to hide behind. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation. I sat there for a moment, phone resting in my palm, staring at the wall. I thought about my mother's confidence, the way she spoke about handling things, the way she assumed consequences wouldn't reach her. She had been wrong. The information I'd just been given changed everything. Not because it gave me power, because it gave me clarity. I went back into the living room. My mother was watching television. My sister was scrolling through her phone. They looked relaxed, secure, like people who believed the situation was under control. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That night, I lay in bed and made a decision that felt heavier than any argument we'd had. I would not protect anyone from the consequences of choices they had made at my expense. That didn't mean I would rush to expose them. It meant I would stop shielding them. The next few days passed quietly on the surface, too quietly. My mother continued to manage the space. My sister continued to settle in. The assumption of permanence thickened in the air. I started moving my important documents into a folder. Passport, lease, insurance papers. I backed up files. I made notes. Nothing dramatic. Just preparation. One evening, my mother mentioned she might need to borrow the spare key for a friend who was stopping by while I was at work. No, I said. She looked surprised, then annoyed. Why not? Because I said no. The room went still. My sister glanced between us. My mother recovered quickly, her voice smoothing out. You're being tense lately. You should try to relax. This stress isn't good for you. I didn't argue. I nodded and changed the subject. But inside, the line had been crossed. I had drawn it quietly, and she had noticed. That night, as I locked my bedroom door, I understood something important. The call I'd made wasn't the end. It was permission. Permission to stop doubting myself. Permission to prioritize reality over loyalty. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I only knew that the next knock on the door wouldn't be accidental. And when it came, it wouldn't be for me. The knock came on a quiet afternoon, the kind that usually meant a delivery or a neighbor asking if we'd seen their package. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was firm and deliberate, the kind of knock that assumes it will be answered. I was standing in the kitchen at the time, rinsing a mug, my back to the door. My mother was in the living room, flipping through channels, my sister stretched out on the couch with her phone. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful. The knock came again. My mother glanced toward the door, irritation flickering across her face. Did you order something? She asked. I shook my head slowly. No. She stood up anyway, already moving like it was her responsibility to handle whatever this was. That small detail didn't escape me. She didn't ask if I wanted to get it. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the door with the confidence of someone who believed they belonged on the other side of it. I beat her to it by a step. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. Calm, professional, neutral. One of them glanced down at a clipboard, then back up at me. Good afternoon, one of them said. Do you live here? Yes, I said. My mother stepped up beside me before I could say anything else. I'm her mother, she said quickly, smiling like she was greeting coworkers. Is there a problem? The officer's expression didn't change. We received a report regarding unauthorized access to this unit, he said. We need to ask a few questions. The room behind me went quiet. I could feel it without turning around. My sister sat up straighter. My mother's smile tightened just a fraction. There must be some mistake, my mother said. We're family. Everything's fine. The officer nodded politely. We understand. This won't take long. They stepped inside, their presence immediately changing the air in the apartment. Not hostile, just official. The kind of presence that doesn't bend to personal explanations. They asked who lived there, who was on the lease, who had keys. I answered when they asked me. Short sentences. No extra details. My mother tried to fill the gaps anyway. She lives alone, my mother said. But we're just helping out. Temporarily. I have a spare key for emergencies. The officer looked at me. Did you authorize the key copy? No, I said. The word landed hard in the space between us. My mother laughed softly. Of course she did. It's not like that. She just doesn't remember. She's been stressed. The officer wrote something down. How many people are currently staying here? He asked. My sister opened her mouth, then closed it again. My mother answered. Just my daughter. And me, occasionally. The officer glanced around the living room. Extra shoes by the door. An open suitcase. A jacket draped over the chair. That doesn't appear to be occasional, he said evenly. I felt my heart start to race, but my voice stayed steady. My sister moved in while I was at work, I said. I didn't give permission. My mother turned toward me sharply. What are you doing? The officer held up a hand. Ma'am, please. The questions continued. When did the additional occupant arrive? Who authorized it? Who coordinated access while I was away? My mother's answers started to blur together. She talked faster, over-explained, contradicted herself without realizing it. She said she had my consent, then said she didn't need it, then said it was for my own good. The officer paused, pen hovering. So to be clear, he said you accessed the apartment using a copied key without the leaseholder's permission. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. We're family, she said. That shouldn't matter. The officer nodded slowly. Unfortunately, it does. My sister stood up, panic creeping into her voice. Is this serious? We didn't do anything wrong. We're just gathering information, the officer said. But unauthorized access and occupancy are taken seriously. I watched my mother's face change then. The confidence drained from it, replaced by something brittle. She tried to recover, straightening her posture, smoothing her hair. This is being blown out of proportion, she said. My daughter tends to overreact. She's always been sensitive. The officer turned to me again. Have you expressed concerns about this arrangement? Yes, I said. Multiple times. My mother shook her head sharply. That's not true. The officer didn't argue. He wrote something down instead. At some point, one of them asked my mother for identification. She hesitated before handing it over. A small pause, but telling. They stepped aside briefly, conferring in low voices. My sister sat back down, her hands twisting together. My mother stood rigidly, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the wall like she was waiting for this to end. When the officers returned, their tone remained calm, but something had shifted. We're going to need to file a report, one of them said. This appears to involve unauthorized access and potential lease violations. We'll also need to follow up with property management. My mother's head snapped up. That's not necessary. We can sort this out privately. The officer met her gaze. At this point, it's no longer a private matter. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over me. The truth was out. Not shouted, not dramatized, just recorded. The officers explained next steps. Follow-up, documentation, possible restrictions on access, nothing explosive, nothing theatrical. Just consequences moving into place. When they finally left, the apartment felt hollow. My mother rounded on me the second the door closed. How could you do that? Do you have any idea what you've started? I looked at her. Really looked at her, standing in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of her assumptions. I told the truth, I said. That's all. My sister started crying. This is insane. We're family. Family doesn't get to override consent, I said quietly. My mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. You've embarrassed me. I felt the weight of that accusation, but it didn't crush me the way it used to. I realized something then, standing there in the aftermath. The story had changed, and she knew it. This wasn't about my apartment anymore. It was about her. And whatever came next was no longer something she could manage with a smile and a spare key. The silence that followed felt heavier than the knock ever had, and as I stood there listening to my sister sob and my mother pace, I understood that this was only the beginning of the fallout. Nothing about this would go back to the way it was. The next morning, the apartment felt like it was holding its breath. My sister stayed in the guest room with the door closed, sniffling on and off, and my mother moved around the kitchen without making breakfast, just opening drawers, shutting them, wiping counters that were already clean. Every few minutes, she checked her phone like she expected it to save her. I tried to go back to my routine. I showered, got dressed, made coffee the way I always did. The normal motions grounded me, but they also highlighted how abnormal everything had become. My mother watched me from the doorway like she was studying a stranger. So she said, "Finally, you're really doing this." I didn't ask what she meant. I knew. Doing this meant refusing to rescue her from consequences. Doing this meant not softening the truth so she could keep her image intact. I'm not doing anything, I said, keeping my voice low. I told them what happened. That's it. She scoffed. You told them your version? I looked at her, the mug warm in my hands. It wasn't my version. It was the facts. You copied a key. You let people into my apartment while I was at work. You moved my sister in without asking me. Those are not feelings. My mother's jaw tightened. She didn't respond, but her eyes shifted, calculating. I recognized that look. It was the same look she used when she was trying to decide which lever to pull: guilt, shame, anger, or charm. My sister came out then, her face, puffy hair pulled into a messy knot. She looked smaller than she had the day she strolled in with her suitcase, like she was entitled to my couch. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. My mother turned on her, instantly softer voice now. Honey, it's fine. We'll straighten it out. Your sister is just upset. She'll calm down. I flinched at the way she said it. Your sister. Not her name. Not my sister. Like I was a separate category, a problem to manage. I left for work after that because staying in the apartment felt like sitting in a room where the air was slowly being pulled out. The hallway outside my door felt brighter than usual, like the building didn't know or care what had just happened inside one unit. At my desk, I tried to focus, but my phone buzzed every hour. Missed calls from my mother, messages from my sister, long emotional paragraphs about family and betrayal and how could you. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew what responding would do. It would give them something to twist, something to argue about, something to cling to instead of dealing with reality. Near the end of the day, an unfamiliar number called. I stepped into an empty conference room and answered, heart steady but alert. This is Officer Daniels, the voice said, following up from yesterday. We have a few additional questions. My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice calm. Okay. The questions were straightforward, but they were different this time. Less about the immediate situation, more about context. Had there been prior disputes involving access to my home? Had my mother done anything like this before? Did I feel safe? Had she ever used keys or access to control a situation? I answered honestly. I said this was the first time she had done it to me, at least that I knew of. I said she had always been controlling, but I hadn't thought she'd cross this kind of line. There was a pause on the other end. The officer cleared his throat. I'm going to be transparent with you, he said. The reason we're asking is because there is a prior report involving your mother's name, different address, different situation, but similar pattern. It came up when we documented yesterday's incident. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, silent exhale. A prior report, I repeated. Yes, he said. We cannot share details without the other party's consent, but we need to confirm whether this is part of an ongoing pattern. It affects how we proceed. My mouth went dry. I thought about the old story my mother had told years ago, the neighbor misunderstanding the way she'd brushed it off, the way no one in the family ever spoke about it again. I thought about how she'd acted so confident this time, as if she'd done it before, and gotten away with it. I asked the officer what he needed from me. He told me they would likely need a written statement from me confirming I did not authorize the key copy, and I did not consent to an additional occupant moving in. He said they would be contacting property management to clarify leaseholder status because access disputes often intersected with occupancy policies. He also said something that landed in my chest like a stone. We also recommend you change your locks as soon as possible, he said. If you feel unsafe, we can advise you on next steps for a protective order, but that's your decision. Protective order. The phrase felt extreme. Not because it was unreasonable, but because it forced me to see how far this had already gone. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the empty room for a moment with my hands flat on the table. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't crying. I just felt cold clarity. It wasn't only that my mother had copied my keys. It was that she had done it before somewhere else, to someone else. And she hadn't learned from it. She had simply moved on to a new target. When I got home that evening, my mother was waiting in my living room, like she had been pacing for hours. The television was off. The lights were too bright. She stood up the second I walked in. "Who called you?" she demanded. I set my bag down carefully. "How did you know someone called me?" She blinked, then recovered. "I can tell when you've been talking to people. You get this look." My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice even. The police followed up. Her face went pale for half a second, then flushed with anger. Why would they follow up? This was supposed to be a simple misunderstanding. "It wasn't," I said. "They asked me questions. About what she snapped. About whether you've done anything like this before." My mother's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd walked into my apartment with that spare key, she looked genuinely rattled. Not angry, not offended, afraid. "That's ridiculous," she said quickly. "They have no right." I stared at her. "Have you done this before?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "Not like this." The answer was too careful, too practiced. I felt a strange ache behind my ribs. Not sympathy, not anger. Just disappointment so deep it felt like fatigue. "There was something years ago," I said. "With a neighbor. You told us it was nothing." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "People exaggerate. You know how they are." "So it was real," I said. "It happened." My sister appeared in the doorway, behind her eyes wide, listening. My mother noticed and turned, her tone shifting instantly into reassurance. "It was nothing," she said to my sister. "Don't worry about it. Your sister is trying to make me look like some kind of criminal." I looked at my sister. This wasn't about making Mom look like anything. This is about her crossing lines and pretending they don't matter because she's family. My sister swallowed. "Mom, did you really copy her key?" My mother's head snapped toward her. "I had a spare for emergencies." "That's not the question," I said quietly. "Did you make a copy without asking me?" She didn't answer right away. She stared at me like she was waiting for me to back down, to soften it, to say it wasn't that serious. When I didn't, her voice hardened. "I did what I had to do," she said. "You were being stubborn. Your sister needed a place. You always do this. You act like everything is an attack." There it was. The moment she tried to flip the story. Not "I crossed a boundary. You made me cross it." Not "I violated your space. You forced my hand." I felt something inside me settle into place. Not rage, not triumph, just clarity. "I'm not the one who made you do anything," I said. "You chose this. You chose to act like my home was yours. And now you're upset that someone wrote it down." My mother's breathing quickened. "You don't understand what this could do to me." I understood perfectly. That's why it mattered. She stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was trying to reclaim control. "We need to fix this. You need to tell them you overreacted. You need to call and say you misunderstood. You can't let this go on my record." My sister looked between us, tense and frightened. "Mom? What record?" My mother ignored, her eyes locked on mine. "This could affect everything. You don't want to be responsible for that." I didn't flinch. "I'm not responsible for what you did," I said. "I'm responsible for protecting myself." The room went quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. My mother stared at me like she couldn't compute it. Like she'd spent decades believing I would always choose her comfort over my own safety, and now the math wasn't working anymore. For a moment I saw the truth land in her face. She wasn't losing because I was louder. She was losing because I was calm, because I wasn't bargaining, because I wasn't trying to make her understand. I was letting the world treat her behavior the way it deserved to be treated. My sister sank onto the couch, hands covering her mouth. "I can't deal with this," she whispered. "I thought this was just a place to stay. I didn't know it was like this." I looked at her and my voice softened just a fraction. "I know you didn't plan the key copy," I said, "but you benefited from it. And you didn't ask questions because it was convenient." She started to cry again, quietly this time. "I didn't have anywhere else." I believed her. I did. But believing her didn't change the reality. Needing help didn't give anyone the right to take what wasn't offered. My mother turned away, pacing, then spun back like she'd found a new angle. Fine, she said sharply. If you want to play it like this, then you can explain it to the family. You can explain why you're doing this to your own mother. People will have opinions. There it was again. The weapon she always reached for. Reputation, community judgment, the fear of being seen as the bad daughter. But something had shifted in me. That fear didn't grab me the way it used to. Maybe because the officer's questions still rang in my ears. Similar pattern. Prior report. Not the first time. I stepped toward the front door, hand on the lock. Tomorrow, I said, I'm changing the locks. You're not letting yourself in here anymore. My mother's eyes widened. You can't do that. I can, I said. And I am. My sister looked up, panicked. Wait, what does that mean for me? It means we're going to figure out a real plan, I said. One that doesn't involve breaking into my home. One that doesn't put my housing at risk. My mother's voice rose. You're blowing up this family. I turned back to her, steady. No, I said. I'm just refusing to keep it together with my own stability. That night, no one slept much. I could hear my mother making calls in the kitchen, her voice low and urgent. I could hear my sister pacing in the guest room, the soft creak of the floorboards like nervous footsteps. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange mix of grief and relief that comes when the truth finally becomes unavoidable. The story my family had told for years, the one where my mother was always the helper and I was always the sensitive one, was cracking open. And once the truth had been spoken to people who didn't care about family titles, once it had been noted and documented and treated like what it was, I knew there would be no erasing it, no matter how loudly anyone protested. In the morning, I would take the next step. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I was done living in a home that could be entered, rearranged, and claimed without my consent. And I had a feeling the real fallout hadn't even started yet. The day after I told them I was changing the locks, the apartment felt strangely hollow, like sound echoed longer than it should. My mother had left early, slamming the door hard enough that the frame rattled. My sister stayed behind, curled up on the couch, eyes red, staring at nothing. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I had spent too many years doing that. I made coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, letting the quiet settle. The absence of voices felt heavier than the shouting had. When my sister finally spoke, her voice was thin. She's furious, she said. She says you're trying to ruin her. I didn't look up. I'm not trying to do anything to her. She rubbed her arms like she was cold. She called Aunt Linda. And Uncle Mark. She's telling everyone you panicked and called the police on your own family. There it was. The narrative. I'd known it was coming. I nodded once. Okay. That was all I said, and it seemed to frustrate her more than if I'd argued. By noon, my phone started buzzing. Messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Some careful, some blunt. Are you okay? What happened? Your mom is really upset. One cousin asked if I was sure I hadn't misunderstood things. An aunt suggested that family issues should stay in the family. I didn't answer most of them. Not because I didn't care, but because I recognized the trap. Explaining myself would pull me back into the role of translator, fixer, peacekeeper. It would invite debate where there was nothing to debate. I sent one message to the family group chat, short and factual. Mom copied my apartment key without my consent and moved someone in while I was at work. I didn't agree to it. I protected my housing. I'm open to talking one-on-one, not arguing in a group. Then I muted the thread. My sister watched me from the couch, eyes flicking between me and her phone. You're really not going to respond? Not today, I said. She sighed and leaned back. I don't know how this got so big. I did. It had always been big. It just hadn't been named. Later that afternoon, the locksmith came. He was polite. Efficient, asked to see my lease and ID, then got to work. The sound of metal clicking and tools scraping echoed through the apartment, sharp and final. My sister sat silently the whole time, watching like she was witnessing something irreversible. When the old lock came off, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. Not relief exactly, more like sadness. I had trusted that lock, trusted the key I'd given away. Changing it felt like admitting that trust had been misplaced. The locksmith handed me the new keys and asked how many copies I wanted. I paused, then said 2. One for me. One spare that would stay with me. He nodded like that made sense and left without comment. My sister stood up after he was gone. So what happens now? Now you need to find another place to stay, I said gently. I can give you a few days to figure it out, but you can't live here. Her eyes filled again. Mom said you'd do this. I sat down across from her. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because this isn't sustainable. You deserve a stable plan that doesn't depend on breaking into my home. She wiped her face angrily. Easy for you to say. You have everything together. That old story again. I took a breath. I have things together because I had to. Not because it was easy. And I can't keep things together for everyone else anymore. She stood there for a moment, then nodded stiffly and went back to the guest room. The door closed softly, not slammed. That felt like something. That evening, my mother called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. She left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled. You've gone too far, she said. People are asking questions. This makes us look bad. Call me when you're ready to apologize. I deleted the message without listening to it again. The next few days were a blur of quiet consequences. My sister packed her things, slowly dragging out the process with sighs and long pauses, like she was hoping I'd change my mind. I didn't. She left on the third day, taking the last of her boxes and a piece of the tension with her. The apartment felt lighter after that, but not peaceful. There was still too much hanging in the air. At work, I was distracted but functional. During lunch, I received an email from property management confirming they'd been contacted by the officers. It was formal and brief. They noted the situation had been documented and reminded me of occupancy policies. No fines, no warnings, just a record. Seeing it in writing made my stomach twist, but it also grounded me. This was real. This mattered. That night, I cleaned the apartment thoroughly. Not because it was dirty, but because I needed to reclaim it physically. I wiped down surfaces, rearranged furniture back to where I liked it, opened windows, and let fresh air in. Each small act felt like a stitch closing a wound. As I worked, I thought about how uneven the consequences felt. My mother faced embarrassment and scrutiny. I faced isolation. People assumed I was cold, dramatic, ungrateful. The old pattern tried to reassert itself, punishing me socially for setting a boundary. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe I could have waited. Maybe I could have softened it somehow. Then I imagined not making that call. Imagined waking up months later with more people living in my apartment, more assumptions layered on top of my silence, more risk attached to my name. The doubt faded. On the fourth day, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short. This is Karen from downstairs. I just wanted to say I heard some things and I'm glad you stood your ground. Your mom tried something similar with my cousin years ago. You did the right thing. I stared at the message for a long time, a small, quiet confirmation from someone with nothing to gain. It steadied me more than any apology could have. That evening, I sat on my couch and watched a movie I'd already seen twice. The familiar dialogue soothed me. Halfway through, my phone buzzed again. A message from my mother. We need to talk. You're tearing this family apart. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed another. Erased that too. Finally, I wrote something simple. I'm willing to talk in a public place, not at my apartment. If voices are raised, I will leave. I sent it and put the phone face down. She didn't reply that night. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, but also a strange calm. The chaos had moved outside of me. For once, I wasn't scrambling to contain it. I went about my day grocery shopping, folding laundry, answering emails, doing normal things in a space that finally felt like mine again. The new lock clicked solidly when I came home, a sound that felt reassuring instead of restrictive. In the afternoon, my mother texted back. Fine. Tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main. Noon. I stared at the message, then nodded to myself. That was the next step. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness. A conversation where I would not be cornered or shamed into backing down. As evening fell, I sat by the window and watched the lights come on in other apartments. Other lives, other boundaries, other versions of family. I thought about how much energy I'd spent trying to be acceptable instead of safe. The aftermath wasn't clean or satisfying. It didn't end with hugs or understanding. It ended with space, with distance, with the realization that protecting myself meant accepting discomfort. And as I turned off the lights and went to bed, I knew the next conversation would matter. Not because it would fix everything, but because it would define what came next. For the first time, I wasn't planning how to survive my family. I was planning how to face them. I arrived at the coffee shop 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could see the door and the street at the same time. I ordered tea even though I wanted coffee. Something calming, something warm, but not sharp. My hands wrapped around the cup as if it could anchor me. I reminded myself why I was here. Not to convince her. Not to fix anything. Just to say what needed to be said without flinching. When my mother walked in, I barely recognized her at first. Her shoulders were stiff. Her steps measured her face set in that careful expression she wore when she was bracing for judgment. She scanned the room, spotted me, and walked over without smiling. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how I was. She sat down and placed her purse on the chair beside her like a barrier. So she said, "You've made quite the mess." I took a slow breath. "We're in public," I said calmly. "I told you, if this turns into yelling, I'll leave." Her lips pressed together. She nodded sharply. "Fine. I'm calm." She wasn't. But she was trying. "People are talking." She continued, lowering her voice. "Family, neighbors, people I work with. They're asking questions." I had to explain myself. I nodded once. I didn't interrupt. She leaned forward. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be looked at like you're some kind of criminal?" I met her eyes. "Do you have any idea what it's like to come home and realize your own mother copied your keys and let people into your apartment while you were at work?" Her gaze flickered. "That again." "Yes," I said. "That again. Because that's the part that matters." She shook her head, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping her. "You're exaggerating." "I didn't break in. I had a key." "A key you copied without asking me," I said. "That's not a technicality. That's the entire issue." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers drummed on the table. "You're making this sound worse than it was." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice steady. "I'm describing it exactly as it happened. You don't like how it sounds because you're hearing it without the family filter." Her eyes narrowed. "You always do this. You take things too far. You don't think about how your actions affect other people." Something in me shifted then. Not anger. Something quieter and stronger. "I thought about that," I said. "I thought about it every night while you were sleeping in my apartment, while my sister unpacked like she lived there, while my housing was at risk. I thought about how your actions affected me. You didn't ask." Her jaw tightened. "I was helping." "You were deciding," I said. "There's a difference." She looked away, staring out the window. For a moment, I thought she might actually sit with that. Then she sighed, heavy and dramatic. You know, she said, I gave up a lot for you kids. I sacrificed. I put myself last. And this is how you repay me. There it was. The familiar pivot. The debt ledger. I didn't rise to it. I didn't argue the past. I kept my focus where it belonged. I'm not talking about what you did when I was a child, I said. I'm talking about what you did last week. In my home. As an adult. Those sacrifices don't give you the right to override my consent now. Her eyes flashed. You sound like a lawyer. I sound like someone protecting herself. She leaned closer, lowering her voice further. This didn't have to involve police. You could have come to me. I did, I said. I told you no. More than once. You ignored it. She shook her head. You weren't thinking clearly. I was thinking clearly enough to know I didn't want this, I said. You just didn't respect that answer. The silence stretched. Cups clinked at nearby tables. Someone laughed across the room. Normal life continued around us while something heavy settled between us. Finally, she spoke again, quieter now. This is going to follow me. Do you understand that? There's paperwork. There's a record. My boss asked questions. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but I didn't let it steer me. I understand that actions have consequences, I said. That's something you taught me growing up. Her eyes snapped back to mine. That's different. How? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No answer came. I took a breath. I'm not enjoying this, I said. I'm not proud of hurting you. But I'm also not going to undo it to make you comfortable. You crossed a line. Someone noticed. That's not something I can fix for you. Her hands clenched in her lap. You could call them? You could say you overreacted. I shook my head. No. Just like that. No explanation. No apology attached. Her face hardened. So that's it. You're choosing this over your family. I met her stare. I'm choosing myself over being controlled. If that feels like an attack on family, then we need to redefine what family means. She scoffed. You always think you're right. I smiled faintly without humor. I don't think I'm right about everything. I know I'm right about my home. She leaned back, crossing her arms. So what do you want? An apology. Is that it? I considered that. An apology would have been nice once. It wasn't the point anymore. What I want is simple, I said. You don't have a key to my apartment. You don't make decisions about my living space. You don't volunteer me for anything without asking. And when I say no, you stop. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. You're giving me rules now. I'm setting boundaries, I said. You can choose whether to respect them. Her voice rose despite herself. And if I don't, then I take distance, I said quietly. Not to punish you. To protect myself. She laughed bitterly. You think you can just cut me out? I shook my head. I think I can decide how much access you have to my life. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. I could see it in her face. The realization that this wasn't a phase, that I wasn't asking permission, that the dynamic had shifted and she couldn't shift it back. She stood abruptly. People nearby glanced over. I stayed seated. I didn't raise you to be like this, she said. You raised me to be responsible, I said. This is me being responsible. She grabbed her purse. I hope you're happy. I looked up at her, calm. I hope you reflect. She hesitated just for a second, like she wanted to say something else. Then she turned and walked out. I sat there for a while after she left, watching the door, waiting for the familiar rush of guilt. It came, but it was quieter than it used to be. Manageable. I finished my tea, paid the bill, walked out into the afternoon sun feeling drained but steady. On the way home, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. Mom said you refused to help her fix things. She's really upset. I typed back slowly. I didn't refuse to help. I refused to lie. There was no reply. When I got home, the apartment greeted me with silence. Real silence. Not the tense kind. The kind that lets you breathe. I set my keys in the bowl by the door and locked it behind me, the new lock clicking firmly into place. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the handle, letting that sound sink in. The conversation hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't softened her, or brought clarity or closure. But it had done something else. It had drawn a line she couldn't cross without consequences she couldn't ignore. And as I moved through my apartment, turning on lights, opening windows, reclaiming corners that had felt invaded just days before, I understood that this was the turning point. Not because she changed, because I didn't bend. The next steps would come. Fallout, stories, more messages, more pressure. But for the first time, I felt ready for it. Because my life no longer revolved around preventing her reaction. It revolved around protecting my peace. The days after that conversation moved slower than I expected. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No explosions, no apologies. Just a quiet recalibration that felt unfamiliar and heavy. My mother didn't call. My sister didn't text. The family group chat stayed muted, but I could see the notifications piling up like unopened mail I no longer felt responsible for sorting. At first, the silence felt like punishment. The old reflex kicked in, the one that told me I had gone too far, that I had finally crossed the invisible line that made me the difficult one. I waited for the guilt to swell the way it always used to. It never fully did. Instead, there was space. Awkward, echoing space, but space all the same. I went back to my routines with a different awareness. Waking up without bracing myself for someone else's mood. Coming home without scanning the room for signs of intrusion. Making plans without checking who might need something from me first. It felt strange, like learning to walk in a body that had been braced for impact for years. At work, I noticed the change almost immediately. I was more focused. Less distracted. When a problem came up, I handled it without the undercurrent of personal chaos buzzing in the background. My manager commented that I seemed lighter, more confident. I smiled and said thank you, but inside I knew it wasn't confidence. It was relief. One afternoon, about a week later, I ran into my neighbor from down the hall in the laundry room. She hesitated when she saw me, then smiled gently. "I hope this isn't awkward," she said. "But I just wanted to say I'm glad you're okay." I looked at her surprised. "Okay." She nodded. "There was some noise last week. People talking. I didn't want to pry, but I know how hard it is when family oversteps." Her words landed softly but firmly. Validation without drama. I thanked her and she squeezed my arm before leaving with her basket. That small moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was big, but because it was simple. Someone saw what had happened and didn't try to explain it away. A few days later, my sister called. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I didn't rush. I didn't brace myself. I just picked up. "Hey," she said. Her voice sounded tired. Not angry, just worn down. "Hey." There was a pause. "Mom's been..." She trailed off. Upset. Defensive. Telling her version of things to anyone who will listen. I didn't respond right away. I let her finish. She sighed. "I moved in with a friend. Temporarily. It's not great, but it's something." "I'm glad you have a place," I said, and meant it. She was quiet for a beat. I didn't know about the key thing she said finally. "I swear. I thought she'd talk to you." She always said she had. I closed my eyes briefly. That's how it always worked. Plausible deniability wrapped in confidence. "I believe you," I said. "But I need you to understand something. Even if you didn't know you benefited from it. And when I asked questions, No one stopped to check if it was okay. I know, she said softly. I see that now. That was new. Not an apology, but awareness. She hesitated. Are you cutting us off? The question was loaded heavy with fear and expectation. I chose my words carefully. I'm not cutting anyone off, I said. I'm changing how much access people have to my life. There's a difference. She exhaled. I don't think Mom understands that. I gave a small, sad smile she couldn't see. I know. After we hung up, I sat on the couch for a long time staring at the wall. That conversation didn't fix anything. It didn't magically restore trust or erase years of patterns. But it was honest. And honesty felt like progress. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself and ate it at the table instead of on the couch. The habit felt ceremonial, like I was reclaiming something small but important. I lit a candle, not for ambiance, for intention. As I ate, I thought about how often I'd confused endurance with strength. How often I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace even when the peace wasn't real. I thought about my mother sitting somewhere with her version of the story, the one where she was misunderstood, where she was the victim of an overreaction, where I had suddenly become ungrateful and cold. I couldn't control that narrative anymore, and for the first time, I didn't want to. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address I recognized. My name written in my mother's careful handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and left it there while I went about my evening. It wasn't avoidance. It was choice. When I finally opened it, there was a single sheet of paper inside. No greeting. No pleasantries. I didn't think it would turn into this, it read. I was trying to help. I don't agree with how you handled it, but I see now that you felt threatened. I still think you could have come to me instead of involving outsiders. I need time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. But it also wasn't denial. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, but because I didn't need to close the loop right then. Time, I realized, would do more than arguments ever could. As the weeks passed, the fallout softened into something quieter. The extended family stopped messaging as often. The shock wore off. New topics replaced the drama. Life moved on as it always does, and I moved with it. I started making plans that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. Small things. A weekend trip. A class I'd been putting off. Dinner with a friend I hadn't seen in months. Each choice felt like a quiet rebellion against the version of myself that had always waited to be needed. One afternoon, as I was leaving my apartment, I paused at the door and looked at the lock. The new one. Solid. Reliable. Mine. I thought about how much weight that simple object now carried. Not just security, but autonomy. A boundary you could hear click into place. That sound had become comforting. I realized then that the hardest part wasn't setting boundaries. It was living with them afterward. Sitting with the discomfort. Letting other people feel what they felt without rushing to fix it. That was the work. I didn't know what the future held with my mother, or my sister, or the rest of my family. Maybe things would improve. Maybe they wouldn't. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again pretend that love meant surrender. And as I turned the key and stepped out into the hallway, I felt something steady under my ribs. Not victory. Not revenge. Just the quiet confidence of someone who finally trusted herself to keep the door closed when it needed to be. The first morning I woke up without checking my phone for messages from my family, I knew something had shifted for good. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt earned, not tense. Sunlight crept through the blinds and landed on the floor beside my bed, warm and ordinary. And for once, ordinary felt like a luxury. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to my own breathing, noticing how my chest rose and fell without that familiar knot of anticipation. No bracing, No rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet. Just the soft hum of the building waking up around me. I got out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The counter was clear, the sink empty. No one else's mug, no half-finished plans left behind like fingerprints. I made coffee and stood by the window watching a woman across the street walk her dog, the leash loose in her hand. The simplicity of it made my throat tighten. This was my space again. Not because I'd won anything, not because anyone else had finally admitted they were wrong. It was mine because I had claimed it and then protected it even when that protection cost me comfort. Later that morning, I sat at the small table by the wall and paid my bills, something I used to do in a rush, distracted, always half expecting a call or interruption. This time, I took my time. I checked my balances, updated a few things, closed my laptop, and felt a small, quiet pride settle in my chest. Responsibility, when it wasn't being used against me, felt grounding instead of heavy. I thought about my mother then, not with anger, but with a kind of tired clarity. I imagined her telling her version of the story to someone new, smoothing the edges, emphasizing her intentions, downplaying the impact. I imagined her frustration at not being able to control the ending anymore. For years, I would have felt compelled to correct the record, to explain myself, to make sure people understood I wasn't heartless or dramatic or ungrateful. I realized I didn't feel that pull anymore. The truth had already been spoken where it mattered. Everything else was noise. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. "I hope you're okay. I'm trying to figure things out. I know things got messed up. I'm sorry for my part in it." I stared at the screen for a long moment. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo anything. But it was real enough. I typed back slowly. "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you land somewhere stable. Take care of yourself." That was all. No lectures, no reopening wounds. Just a clean exchange that respected where we both were now. I put the phone down and went about my day. I went for a walk. I picked up groceries. I stopped at a small bookstore and wandered the aisles without checking the time. Each small choice felt like practice, like learning how to live without constantly scanning for approval. That evening, I cooked a meal I liked, not something easy to share or reheat or stretch for multiple people. Just enough for me. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, letting my thoughts wander. I thought about how close I had come to losing all of this without realizing it. How easily my home could have stopped being mine if I'd kept choosing silence over discomfort. How many times I had told myself it wasn't that bad, that it would blow over, that family meant compromise. What I understood now was that compromise without consent isn't compromise at all. It's surrender dressed up as virtue. After dinner, I washed the dishes and dried them immediately instead of leaving them in the rack like I used to. Another small thing. Another marker of presence. I moved through the apartment, turning off lights, straightening a cushion, closing a window. When I reached the front door, I paused, hand resting on the knob. I thought about the sound it made now when it locked, solid and decisive. I thought about the old key that no longer worked, about the false sense of safety I'd had when I handed it over years ago without thinking. Trust, I realized, isn't about giving people access. It's about giving it thoughtfully and taking it back when it's abused. A few days later, my mother called again. I let it ring this time too, but instead of deleting the voicemail right away, I listened. Her voice was quieter than it had been before. Not soft exactly, but subdued. "I'm still upset," she said. "I don't agree with everything you did. But I don't want us to be strangers. I don't know how to fix this. I guess I'm calling to say, I don't know. I need time." I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in my hand, and let her words settle. There was no demand in her voice, no instruction, just uncertainty. I didn't call her back right away. I didn't need to. The difference now was that I trusted myself to decide when and how instead of reacting out of fear. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because I looked different, but because of the way I was standing. Shoulders relaxed, jaw unclenched, eyes steady. I thought about the version of me from weeks ago, the one who came home to a space that no longer felt safe, who questioned her own instincts, who wondered if she was overreacting. I felt a wave of compassion for her. She had done the best she could with the tools she had then. And now, she had more. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run, something I hadn't done in months. The air was cool. My lungs burned, my legs protested, but there was something cleansing about the effort. With each step, I felt more present in my body, less caught in my head. As I slowed to a walk and caught my breath, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't replaying conversations anymore. I wasn't rehearsing defenses or imagining future confrontations. The story had reached its ending, even if the relationships themselves were still unfolding. When I got back home, flushed and tired, I showered and changed, then sat down with a notebook. On the first page, I wrote a short list. Not rules. Reminders. My home is mine. My no means no. Love does not require access. Discomfort is not danger. I closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need to look at it every day. Just knowing it was there felt like insurance. Later that afternoon, I called my mother back. We talked for 20 minutes. Not about the incident, not about blame, just about neutral things. Her garden, a show she'd been watching, the weather. When the conversation started to edge toward old territory, I gently steered it back or said I needed to go. She noticed. I could tell. But she didn't push. When we hung up, I felt tired but not drained. That was new. Weeks passed. Life settled into a rhythm that felt like my own. There were still moments of sadness, flashes of grief for the family dynamic I wished I'd had. But there was also a deep, steady peace underneath it all, one that didn't depend on anyone else behaving a certain way. I had stopped waiting for permission to live. One evening, as I sat on my couch with a book I wasn't even really reading, I thought about how this all started. A copied key. A quiet violation. A moment that forced me to choose between keeping the peace and keeping myself safe. I chose myself. That choice didn't make me cruel. It didn't make me selfish. It made me an adult in my own life. If you've ever been the reliable one, the flexible one, the person everyone counts on, because you always make it work, I want you to know something. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to say no, even if it makes things uncomfortable. You are allowed to protect what's yours, including your time, your space, your peace. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It's closing the door and not reopening it, just because someone knocks the way they always have. As I turned off the lamp and let the apartment settle into darkness, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. Whatever came next, I would face it from solid ground. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt that tug between obligation and self-respect, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience, stay with the channel, and know you're not alone in learning how to choose yourself.